Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our Daily Penguin. This is our March of the Penguins through my Penguin Classic collection. One book at a time, one author at a time, one period at a time. And the period that we are doing, we are still in the ancient world, ancient Greece and Rome. And I inadvertently took the weekend off, but one of the last people that we talked about was the Roman poet Martial and his epigrams and his poems. And I mentioned in that video, it was possible, I suppose, for the sharpest among you to determine in that video that I perhaps am not a fan of Martial. But I mentioned in that video that one of the wonderful things about his poems, whether you like them or not, is that they give you snapshots, inadvertent thumbnails of the Rome of his day amidst the catty satire. And that led me to think about an author that we could do today. And the author we could do today is someone who does the same thing, only at infinitely greater length. And I think infinitely more accessible and approachable, enjoyable demeanor. And that is Lucian. This is the Penguin Classic volume, Chattering Courtesans and Other Sardonic Sketches. A lovely Penguin Classic volume where the translation and all the notes introduction are done by Keith Sidwell. A terrific edition of Lucian. Who was born in the early 2nd century in Samothrace, at least if we can believe him. We don't have any information about him that he doesn't give us himself, which was in the Roman province of Syria. And he grew up in the Roman world, had satellite positions here and there, including an imperial position in Egypt. There's some question as to whether or not he ever actually officially achieved Roman citizenship. I think he did. And the whole time he wrote, he was irritated slightly by the Greek philosophy pretensions of a lot of the intellectual world of his day, and a lot of the things that he writes sort of rail against cynicism or anything like that. Any formal, not cynicism with a small c, cynicism with a large c, any kind of formal philosophical worldview like that. These are comic dialogues set all kinds of situations. My one complaint, as usual, about this Penguin Classic volume is that it isn't big enough. The translator, Keith Sidwell, in his introduction, if I remember correctly, mentions that he chose the bits and pieces of Lucian to include in this volume so as not to have them overlap with other editions of Lucian. And that would be Oxford World Classics. That has to be what he's thinking of. And that's not a good reason. The Oxford World Classics volume wasn't translated by you. It wasn't annotated by you. You're giving us a slightly different version. All of Lucian should be in here. But even so, this is, in my opinion, a much better version of Lucian than the previous Penguin Classic version, which I think called just Satirical Sketches or something like that. It was an old mass-market paperback of Penguin Classic, and I thought that it was kind of wooden. Whereas this translator is never wooden, and Lucian certainly never is. He's amazing. He's absolutely amazing. The only problem is the form that he's chosen in which to be amazing doesn't really exist anymore. Nobody does dialogues anymore, unfortunately. And so the hallmarks, the benchmarks of what a great comedic or philosophical or literary rhetorical dialogue would be are largely gone. It's an alien genre to most readers. But it's a genre in which the writer can have a huge amount of fun and also be a huge amount of serious. These things vary all over the map. Unfortunately, some of my favorite bits from Lucian aren't in here. The Ignorant Book Collector, for instance, is howlingly funny, even now, and very much applies even now. The internet has done nothing but reinforce the sarcastic, biting points that Lucian makes about book snobs of all kinds. And that's not in here. And there are a couple of others that I really like that aren't in here. But there's a great deal that is in here. This is twice the size of the previous Penguin Lucian selection. And I believe that even if you are unfamiliar with the comedic dialogue, you will get what's going on after a while. It's really good writers, the ones who do it really well, invest the made-up spokespeople with character. We're usually not told that character. You have to sort of infer it from their speech, but you become involved with these discussions. It's a very immediate way of reading, and it can be very, very funny, especially when both the people in the dialogue are flawed in complementary ways. That makes it even more fun. And it has a long literary tradition. When I mention comedic dialogues, a couple of you anyway, are going to know the name that I'm going to say. You're going to know it, even if you hadn't watched any of my videos. And that, of course, is the Dutch humanist Erasmus, who one of the bestsellers in a lifetime of writing, one of his bestsellers, ongoing bestsellers throughout his whole life, he just kept adding to it, was his dialogues, which are strictly along the Lucian line. And that line of attribution is absolutely sure. I'm not guessing when I say that, because Erasmus loved Lucian, loved reading him so much that he actually published a translation of some of Lucian's bits and pieces, some of Lucian's dialogues, that was a collaboration with his best friend, Thomas More. and that translation is full. It's full of commentary. It's really well done, and it clearly informs Erasmus's own work in comedic dialogue. I'm racking my brains to try and think of when the comedic dialogue died out. I have a feeling that I can blame the same thing that I like to blame everything on here, which is the rise of the novel. Because in a way, a comedic dialogue is a kind of proto-novel. But one way or another, Lucian does what Martial does. Often. He often shows us the world that he's living in. Even though that's not his aim. Even though he's aiming at other things like vanity or pretentiousness in the literary world or whatever the thing is that he does. He's aiming at those other things, and he's talking about those other things, and he's massively elusive, so he's constantly bringing up other authors, whether by name or not. And that's his main goal, and that's a lot of fun. But as somebody interested in the ancient world, in addition to reading the literature of the ancient world, I love just gobbling up the little details about the world, that come through in Lucian, that come through nowhere else. And long after he had a long literary tradition, long after Erasmus and More loved him enough to work on translating him together, he was still being discussed and admired by scholars. Well into the early part of the 20th century, he was being discussed and loved by scholars, by classicists, by historians, who plow their way through a whole bunch of ancient authors, some of whom we'll get to. They plow their way through a whole bunch of ancient authors who just aren't any fun. They just aren't any good company. And then you get to Lucian, and it's like a light comes on in a dark room. He's wonderful company. And one of those scholars I have with me today, one of those scholars is Professor Samuel Dill, who wrote a 2-volume work about Roman society that is very literary. It's about Roman society, but it's very focused on literature as much as it can be. These came out in, when was this? 1911. The first edition was 1904. Second edition was the year later. There were a bunch of editions after that. And he was read everywhere. And he has one of those Victorian literary styles that just never gets old. It never goes out of fashion. It's always beautiful. And after all, he's writing about figures, literary figures, historical figures, about whom there is no new news. So when people, you can't, of course, find Samuel Dill anywhere in a bookstore now. You'd have to get him at a used bookstore or online for probably an exorbitant price. I hope not. But when people ask me, why is this old book, this 100-year-old book on Roman society, why is it here in your little book room when no later work on Roman society is? Well, that's why, because you can't get any better than this. So why would I bother with the quote unquote latest scholarship? And Dill, when he gets to Lucian, writes about him with clear affection. I don't so much agree with his overarching point here, but I want you to listen for the affection. The triumphs and splendors of corporate life in the age of the Antonines are certainly a dazzling spectacle. Yet to the student who is more occupied with the painful moral education of the race, the interest lies in a different direction. It was a worldly age, but it was also an age ennobled by a powerful protest against worldliness. And in this chapter we shall study a great movement, which, under the name of philosophy or culture, called the masses of men to a higher standard of life. This movement, like all others of the same kind, had its impostors who disgraced it. Yet the man who has pursued them with such mordant ridicule and pitiless scorn, the man who was utterly skeptical as to the value of all philosophic effort, in the last resort approaches very near to the view of human life which was preached by the men whom he derides. Lucian belongs to no philosophical school. He would himself have repudiated adhesion to any system. The advice of Tiresias to Menippus when he sought him in the shades would certainly have been Lucian's to any young disciple who consulted him, that being, have done with all verbal subtleties and chimeras, swear allegiance to no sect, make the best of the present, and take things generally with a smile. Now, Dill has that sort of whimsical idea that he thinks that actually Lucian was far more of a cynic with a capital C than an enemy of the cynics. I don't know. It's fun to read. I don't know that I believe that, but one way or another, it shows you that up until comparatively recently, this was an author who was alive. I myself don't believe, despite the fact that I'm holding up a Penguin Classic, keep in mind these things are often aimed at schools, I don't believe this author is alive anymore. I don't think anyone's ever heard of him or reads him for pleasure at all, unlike some of the authors that we've seen in this Daily Penguin, and that's a shame. That's a shame, of course. I wish that this excellent translator did a volume of Lucian for Penguin that was all of Lucian, but or more. I'm always hungry for more. When I felt the same way about the Oxford World Classic Edition, I read through it and thought, okay, the introduction and the notes here are fantastic, but I want more. You're not including all of my favorite bits. But anyway, that is your Penguin Classic for today. This is Lucian. We will continue on all week long, and we'll see what other gems we uncover as I drag you through my Penguin Classics. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.